Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Robert Litwak. Rob is Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies at the Wilson Center. He's a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory and served as on the National Security Council staff as Director for Non-Proliferation during the Clinton administration. And the prolific Rob Litwak has written a new book, and it's titled Managing Nuclear Risks. Rob, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
So in thinking of how to begin this discussion, as we will dive into the ideas in the book, Rob, I had the notion that you and I are both old enough to remember when the threat of nuclear war and nuclear weapons was the existential threat. And now we live in the age of climate change and pandemic. I'm wondering, in your estimation, are we complacent now about the nuclear threat? Has that dangerously drifted into the background of our consciousness?
Well, that's a great opening question, John. I mean, we are living during not only a pandemic, but also a presidential campaign now. And I was reminded that in 2004, the moderator asked President Bush and Senator Kerry, what is the greatest threat facing the United States? And in 2004, they both said, nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. Now that was 3 years after 9/11, when there was concern about a nuclear 9/11. And indeed, Al-Qaeda and such groups have expressed an interest in acquiring nuclear weapons to carry out a mass casualty spectacular attack. In the years since, as you kind of alluded to, memories of 9/11 and the Cold War, where nuclear issues dominated, has receded. I think last year there was a poll of Americans' fears, and a nuclear event was number 29 or on that list, really down the list. We're living through a pandemic, and we hope we're living through a pandemic. We're trying to get through a pandemic, and unfortunately, many of our citizens have not made it. And we have experienced in this year, over the summer, certainly, the harbingers of climate change with extreme weather, forest fires, hurricanes, etc. So these two global disruptors, climate change and the pandemic, command our daily attention in a way that the nuclear issues don't. But yet, as I've argued in the new monograph, across the different categories of nuclear weapons and terrorism, proliferation, the risk now is higher than it has been at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that would be a third global disruptor: pandemic, climate change, and I would add a nuclear event as a global disruptor that's not getting the attention it merits.
And exactly why is the risk at the highest level since the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I go through, as I mentioned, there are three nuclear categories. There's relations among nuclear weapon states. There's so-called horizontal proliferation, which is the extension of nuclear weapons to additional states. And the third category is nuclear terrorism. Now, under each of these categories in the book, I identify a dilemma. Let me mention one just to give you a flavor of the analysis. I can take you through the other two, but let me start with relations among nuclear weapon states. We've gone, John, from a bipolar nuclear world, and you and I have been doing this long enough that we probably started these conversations during the era of nuclear, bipolarity. We now live in a multipolar nuclear world, and the risks have really become more heightened. We have more nuclear weapon states. There are now 9 states with nuclear weapons. And across the globe, we experience it in this country, but it's a global phenomenon. Foreign policy is being renationalized, what in America is called America First or Brexit. There are counterparts in Russia, China. Foreign policies among the powers are becoming more nationalistic in a sense, and less amenable to international cooperation, institutions, etc. So you have that going on. In addition, and compounding it in a way, is the rise of regional flashpoints. The South China Sea, Kashmir, which has been a traditional one. We saw India and China fight on their Himalayan border. You've seen Russia make a land grab in Europe, occupying and annexing the Crimea. So you have the regional flashpoints that engage nuclear weapon states. All right, that leads to the 1914 analogy of war beginning through inadvertent escalation. You have a flashpoint, it escalates, draws in the powers. But making it even more dangerous is the other historical marker, which is 1962, when you had a nuclear crisis because the Soviet Union then sought to redress the nuclear balance through a desperate effort, a desperate bid to rebalance the balance of terror by deploying nuclear weapons in Cuba. And we're seeing now, with the end of arms control and with the development of new technologies and technologies beyond nuclear, as in cyber, space, other conventional weapons that can be deployed at long distances, as well as through ballistic missiles, as well as low-yield nuclear weapons. You're beginning to see that the nuclear deterrent relationship is becoming more complicated, certainly, and arguably more dangerous. So the bumper sticker on this first set of issues, the challenge of nuclear weapon states, I would say 1914 meets 1962, where you have a regional flashpoint that could escalate, but then compounded by the danger of escalation to the nuclear level as in 1962. So it's 1962 meets 1914 meets 1962.
Mm-hmm. This end of arms control, with the last major agreement between Russia and the United States on life support, do you view this as sort of an anomaly, a sign of the times that could change with a change in leadership in the United States, or is this a trend?
I think if a trend constitutes more than one data point that you draw a line through, I think we're seeing a trend, because over the last 20 years, with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, et cetera, the open skies, you see, and we did a program on that some months ago, you see the atrophying of arms control, agreements that had been concluded during the heyday of great power or superpower arms control between the early 1970s and the mid-late 1990s. That architecture is being dismantled. And what it opens the door to is unconstrained competition among nuclear weapon states. And that's a source of potential instability.
About that, North Korea, Iran, these were pressing issues, and they were even pressing issues for this administration not too long ago, and now they've just sort of disappeared. What are the current statuses of both?
They've disappeared because diplomacy is stalled, and the nuclear saber rattling that occurred in 2017 has abated. In his book Rage, Bob Woodward chronicles the administration, but notes that in 2017 we were much closer to war than the public was aware. Now, you've asked me about Iran and North Korea. That's my second category. Okay, so the first category was relations among nuclear weapon states. Okay, and now we're moving to the second category, which is so-called horizontal proliferation, the extension of nuclear weapons to additional states. We don't live, thankfully, in the nightmare world that John Kennedy talked about in the early 60s, of a world of 35 nuclear weapon states or whatever. Most countries don't believe they need nuclear weapons as the answer to their national security dilemmas. What you have are the 5 permanent members of the UN, which have nuclear weapons and were grandfathered, so to speak, into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You have 3 states, India, Pakistan, and Israel, which is acknowledged but undeclared nuclear weapon state, which did not join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They exercised their sovereign right not to join. The international law is voluntaristic, unlike domestic law where we have to pay taxes and obey speed limits. In contrast to India, Pakistan, and Israel, which exercise their sovereign right not to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, North Korea and Iran both signed up to the deal, so to speak. They joined the NPT, and that's why those states are treated differently than the non-signatory states. But in addition, for the United States, since the end of the Cold War, not only are North Korea and Iran countries of concern, but they're also adversarial proliferators. They are adversaries of the United States. They combine capabilities with hostile intent. They're the so-called rogue states, which I've written about. And there we have the second dilemma. If the first dilemma that I was talking about was 1914 meets 1962, the second dilemma is, what should be the objective in dealing with a rogue state? Should it be regime change or should it be behavior change? Should we pursue transactional diplomacy focused on the discrete nuclear issue, which is urgent and immediate, or should we pursue more comprehensive diplomacy, transformational diplomacy that would address the whole set of concerns that we have with each of these countries? In my study, I make the case for transactional diplomacy to decouple, because at the core, the crux of the critique of transactional diplomacy, the transformationalists, so to speak, hold this view that transactions don't get you there because the threat derives from the character of the regime. So in order to address the danger, you have to change the regime. But the Trump administration denies that it's pursuing regime change toward North Korea and Iran. But if you look at what they're asking for, it really would require a different kind of regime in each of those capitals to achieve a deal. That's why I focus on transactional deals to constrain capabilities, and that decouples the nuclear issue from the longer term speculative question of regime change or regime evolution.
Well, let's continue in a linear fashion then and go to number 3, which is nuclear terrorism. Mm-hmm. That was certainly on the minds of the world in an acute way after 9/11. And as we've discussed already, it's receded into the background. What do we know about the current efforts by actors, terrorists to attain nuclear weapons?
Well, here, my third dilemma is that the threat arises primarily, almost exclusively, from non-state actors. I mean, Al-Qaeda had an expressed interest in acquiring nuclear weapons. Osama bin Laden talked about that. ISIS, or ISIL as it's now called, their publication, their house newspaper called for them acquiring nuclear weapons so they could conduct an attack that would be truly spectacular. So we know that terrorist groups intent on carrying out mass casualty attacks are interested in acquiring nuclear weapons, the non-state. But my focal point is on the link between non-state and state, because, and this is the dilemma, non-state capabilities rely on some form of state involvement. Okay, if a non-state actor is going to acquire a nuclear weapon, if they're going to buy it, if they're going to steal it, or they're going to build it, it requires a state. Because Al-Qaeda may have an interest, an intent to acquire nuclear weapons, and their only constraints are practical and technical. They're not moral or political. They would, if they acquired a nuclear weapon, they would use it. But in order to buy, steal, or build, they need a state, because Al-Qaeda doesn't have its own uranium enrichment program. Okay, so what it requires is a state to either be negligent in controlling fissile material, weapons usable fissile material, or weapons on their territory, or transferring a weapon to another state. When we think about nuclear terrorism, then the countries of concern are Russia and Pakistan, because they have a lot of material, and the concern there is what the specialists call leakage, that it could be illicitly obtained. Not that the state would have decided to do it, but rather that inadequately secured materials or weapons could fall into the wrong hands, leakage. The other scenario is transfer. And of North Korea, a former Secretary of Defense said, North Korea would sell anything to anyone. And there, the threat has been maybe they would sell capability to a non-state actor if the price was right. These two different routes, leakage and transfer, require differentiated strategies of deterrence, which I can elaborate on. But one last point, which country is missing? Interestingly, strikingly, I'll go even ironically, the lead state sponsor of terrorism of Iran would not be a prime suspect if a nuclear weapon were to go off on US or allied soil. The reason being that is under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, Iran's nuclear program has been constrained. They have not had access to weapons usable material. So if a weapon went off, I think the top of the list would be Russia, as terms of the source of it, Russia and Pakistan, and then North Korea would be a third country of concern.
So I know that there is, with the stakes so high, you can't be complacent about any of these scenarios. But I want to ask you the what keeps you up at night question in terms of whether it's India, Pakistan, or China and India, and or leakage, or any of these potential scenarios, South China Sea, where things could escalate. Is there any hierarchy of threat in your mind, which is the most that you have the most concern about?
It's hard to say. I mean, a couple of years ago, I would have gone with terrorism, but I think that, I mean, you are doing these programs all the time, talking to world experts from around the world. You can see, you know, you've done programming on the phenomena that I've discussed here, the renationalization of foreign policy. You've had all kinds of programs on regional flashpoints. I think the combination of what's going on with the regional flashpoints, the fact that we had two pairs of nuclear weapon states actually engaged in border skirmishes at a time when the nuclear deterrent relationships are becoming certainly more complicated and I think persuasively more dangerous. That is the new mix. So I think each of the different categories presents a threat. And I wrote the book as sort of a lockdown exercise while we're preoccupied with what affects our daily lives, such as the pandemic, and then what we witness with climate change. So I wrote this book to survey across the three categories and to do what the Wilson Center does, I think, which is to provide analytical clarity. I mean, I'm a citizen, I have views, they're in the book there, but what I tried to do is provide an analytical framework for looking at them by highlighting the dilemmas under each of these three categories of nuclear weapons or nuclear capabilities. Relations among nuclear weapon states, I point to the dilemma of 1914 meets 1962. For so-called horizontal proliferation to additional states, where the danger is defined in terms of not the capabilities, but the threat of the regime. The dilemma there is, do you go for transactional or transformational? And then for the third tranche, nuclear terrorism, this tension between between state capabilities falling into non-state hands. And these are policy tensions, John. They can't be resolved, but if clearly understood, they can be managed. And I think that speaks to what the mission of the Wilson Center is, to provide analytical clarity, because this ain't the law of thermodynamics, even though it's about physics. Reasonable people can disagree, and I do lay out my own policy preferences, but the framework is one which will allow an engaged public and hopefully the expert community as well to assess different options and providing the necessary context for thoughtful consideration.
Well, Rob, the clarity that you promise is delivered in spades. It's really terrific work in that regard, and as it has been in your whole career. I want to ask you one more question. I was, again, thinking about how to approach this discussion, and as you said, I've followed your work over the years. You know, there was a time where the building block for assessing or addressing this threat was a deterrence, mutually assured destruction. Is there a single word or strategy that would describe what the foundational building block could be moving forward?
Well, let me talk about deterrence in two respects. The first is that one of the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis was, and as uncomfortable as it is, that a stable deterrent relationship with the Soviet Union was based on our mutual vulnerability. And as you get more states acquiring these capabilities, like North Korea, we don't want to live in a state of vulnerability with North Korea because of the character of the regime. But in a sense, North Korea is beyond that point now. They have capabilities that are able to strike the US homeland with a nuclear weapon. And short of preventive war that would be catastrophic, we will have to rely on deterrence with North Korea, as we do with China and Russia, to deter attack. And that's an uncomfortable state. But and in a way, the rogue state optic got in the way of us treating North Korea as a non-crazy state. All right. North Korea is not a normal state, but it's not a crazy state. And I think one of the benefits of the summit meetings that President Trump held was that it's normalized North Korea in a way. They're not viewed now as a crazy state. And therefore, and this was debatable a couple of years ago, would deterrence work against North Korea? And I think now we're going to have to rely just on plain old deterrence, as well as diplomacy to try to constrain their capabilities. The other form of deterrence I want to talk about, and the academic literature distinguishes between this, is deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. Much of what we do in the terrorism area is really deterrence by denial, making it hard for adversaries to attack our cyber capabilities by making them impervious to attack or less vulnerable to attack. Locking down nuclear capabilities is a form of deterrence by denial. If you secure the weapons and the materials, you're denying access to a terrorist group. That's deterrence by denial. We also rely on deterrence by punishment. In the terrorism area, we've laid down a very clear marker to North Korea. If North Korea transfers these capabilities or weapon to a non-state actor, a terrorist group, then really all bets are off at that point in terms of dealing with the regime, because at that point it becomes a world order issue, and the acute risk danger of the regime. If they want to ensure regime survival and stability, a quick way of bringing down the entire world community on North Korean regime, and in favor of a regime change option, would be if they were to start transferring their capabilities to an ISIL or to an Al Qaeda. I think they're aware of it, and in that sense, deterrence by punishment, deterring them from doing it by the credible threat of punishment, is functioning.
Well, Rob, as always, thanks for another terrific contribution to a most important discussion. The book is Managing Nuclear Risks. You can read it for free if you come to wilsoncenter.org. The author is Robert Litwak. Thanks again, Rob.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to our viewers as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.